Imagine a shadow that never ends. Imagine a man who didn't just want to rule the world, but wanted to own the very memory of it. You've been told the story of a great builder, a warrior king, a living god. You've seen the statues. You've heard the name, Ramses II. But everything you think you know is a ghost, a carefully engineered hallucination. Behind the golden mask wasn't a hero, but a predator with a crown. A man so terrified of being forgotten that he murdered the past to secure his future. He didn't build a legacy, he committed a metaphysical heist. He reached into the afterlife and dragged the souls of his ancestors into the dirt, just to make room for his own face. Today, we aren't celebrating a king. We are cracking open the skull of history's most dangerous fraud. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. History is written by the victors, but Ramses II didn't just write it. He chiseled it into the bone of the earth. He understood a dark, fundamental truth: stone doesn't argue. If you carve a lie deep enough into granite, it eventually becomes the truth. Walk through the desert. Look at the monuments. You see his name everywhere. Usamata Setepenre. It echoes across the pylons of Karnak and the cliffs of Abu Simbel. For centuries, we believed he built it all. We were wrong. Ramses II was not a creator. He was a scavenger, an architectural parasite. Imagine the sound of 10,000 chisels. It wasn't the sound of creation. It was the sound of desecration. Ramses didn't wait for his own monuments to be finished. He was too impatient for that. He looked at the masterpieces of his predecessors, men like Amenhotep III and his own father, Seti I, and he saw targets. To Ramses, a beautiful temple wasn't a tribute to the gods. It was a blank canvas for his own vanity. He sent assassin crews into the most sacred spaces of Egypt. Under the cover of flickering torches, these men didn't build. They erased. They targeted the cartouches, the sacred oval frames that protected a king's name. In the Egyptian mind, your name was your soul, your Ren. As long as your name was spoken or seen, you lived forever in the field of reeds. To erase a name wasn't just vandalism. It was metaphysical murder. Ramses ordered his workers to grind away the names of the dead. He watched as the identities of great kings were turned into white dust. Then, he did something even more sinister. He didn't just put his name on top. He ordered his sculptors to carve his name inches deep into the stone. Why? Because he was a thief who knew how thieves worked. He knew that one day, another king might come along and try to steal his glory. So he gouged his identity so deep into the granite that to remove his name would be to destroy the building itself. He turned his stolen legacy into a fortress of ego. He didn't want to share eternity. He wanted to hijack it. He wanted every future generation to look at the horizon and see only one face. His face. Cold. Symmetrical. Dead. He was a man consumed by his own reflection. He wasn't building for the gods. He was feeding a monster that lived inside his own mind, a hunger for power that required the total obliteration of everyone who came before him. This wasn't leadership. It was a slow-motion war against time itself. And for 3,000 years, his plan worked. We called him the Great. We should have called him the Eraser. Ramses II didn't just want the stones. He wanted the souls of the living. To do that, he had to break the only power in Egypt that could challenge a king, the priesthood of Amun. For centuries, the priests of Karnak were the shadow government of the Nile. They weren't just holy men in white linen. They were titans, They owned the most fertile land. They controlled the gold mines of Nubia. They held the keys to the afterlife. A pharaoh ruled the body of Egypt, but the priests of Amun ruled its spirit. They could legitimize a king, or they could make him a footnote in history. Ramses saw them. He watched them from his throne, and he didn't see allies. He saw a rival power structure. He saw a virus, and he decided to suffocate it, not with swords, but with architecture. Imagine the great hypostyle hall at Karnak. It is a forest of 134 massive sandstone columns, reaching 80 feet into the dark Egyptian sky. Before Ramses, this was a place of mystery, a place where the gods whispered to the elect. Ramses turned it into a billboard for his own ego. He didn't just add to the temple, he invaded it. He flooded every square inch of those columns with his own image. He forced the priests to walk through a labyrinth of his own face. Every time a priest offered incense to the god Amun, he had to do it in the shadow of a 60-foot statue of Ramses. He was weaponizing the sacred space. He was telling the priests, "You think you serve the Creator? Look up. I am the Creator." This was a psychological siege. He didn't execute the high priests. That would have made them martyrs. Instead, he made them irrelevant. He promoted himself from a mortal messenger to a living deity. He demanded that the priests perform rituals not just for him, but to him. He effectively hijacked the national religion and turned it into a personality cult. He was a master of the visual trademark. He standardized his face across the empire. It didn't matter which sculptor worked on the stone. The jawline had to be perfect. The expression had to be one of terrifying calm. If a master craftsman slipped, if the symmetry was off by a fraction of an inch, the punishment was savage. He wasn't just building a temple, he was enforcing a brand. By the time he was done, the priesthood of Amun was hollowed out. They still wore the robes. They still performed the chants. But they were prisoners in their own sanctuary. They were surrounded by a stone reality that said there was no god but Ramses. He had erased the line between the throne and the heavens, and in doing so, he ensured that no one, not even the most powerful men in the kingdom, could imagine a world without him. He was the predator with a crown, and his favorite prey was the truth. Ramses II didn't just steal the past, he ground the present into the dust to build his future. To create a scale of architecture that had never been seen, monuments so large they made previous kings look like children playing with sand. He needed a resource more valuable than gold. He needed bodies. Endless, replaceable, expendable human bodies. Imagine the granite quarries of Aswan. This wasn't a construction site. It was an open-air furnace of human suffering. Thousands of men, conscripted peasants, prisoners of war, the shattered souls of the empire, were marched into these blinding white canyons. Most of them never marched out. The conditions were an engineering of pure agony. The temperature regularly hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no shade. There was no mercy. But the real horror wasn't the heat, it was the dust. The Egyptians didn't have iron tools strong enough to cut granite. They used a dolerite pounder, a 12-pound sphere of stone harder than the bedrock. Imagine a man standing in a trench. He lifts that 12-pound stone above his head and slams it down. Over and over. 10 hours. 12 hours. 14 hours a day. The shockwave from every impact traveled through his wrists, up his forearms, and into his shoulders, slowly pulverizing his joints from the inside. But with every strike, a fine cloud of crystalline silica dust rose into the air. The workers breathed it in with every desperate gasp. That dust acted like microscopic glass fragments. It shredded their lungs from the inside. Within months, these men developed a wet, rattling cough. They were coughing up their own lung tissue onto the white rock. When a worker finally collapsed, he wasn't given a burial. He was dragged away by the ankles to a pile of the dead, and a new man was shoved into his place before the dust had even settled. Ramses didn't care. To him, a human life was the cheapest material in his empire. A peasant was worth less than the wooden sledges used to haul the stone. He needed his 1,000-ton obelisks. He needed his seated colossi. If 1,000 men had to die to move a single block of stone, that was simply the cost of doing business. He was the predator because he consumed his own people to feed his ego. He turned the Nile into a conveyor belt of blood-soaked stone. These monuments weren't built with devotion. They were built with the literal friction of human flesh against granite. Every polished surface of a Ramses statue is a mirror made of sweat and silence. He wasn't a great builder. He was the manager of a national slaughterhouse. And the meat he processed was the spirit of Egypt itself. In 1274 BC, the god finally stepped out of his temples and into the dirt. Ramses II wanted a war. He didn't want it for strategy or for safety. He wanted it for the mural. He needed a victory so massive it would make the stars look small. He set his sights on the city of Kadesh, a Hittite stronghold in modern-day Syria. He marched 20,000 men into the furnace of the desert. But Ramses didn't march like a general. He marched like a tourist in his own fantasy. He was so blinded by his own propaganda that he committed the ultimate military sin. He believed his own lies. He pushed his lead division, the division of Amun, miles ahead of his reinforcements. He was isolated. He was arrogant. And he was walking straight into a slaughterhouse. The Hittite king, Muwatalli II, wasn't a god. He was a professional. He had 3,000 heavy chariots behind the walls of Kadesh. He waited. He watched as the Egyptian living god set up a golden pavilion, sat on a folding throne, and began drinking wine while his soldiers dropped from heat exhaustion. The trap didn't just snap, it detonated. 2,500 Hittite chariots erupted from the tree line like a wall of screaming bronze. This wasn't a skirmish. This was mechanized annihilation. The Egyptian division of Ra, caught mid-march with their shields on their backs, simply ceased to exist. They were pulverized. The survivors fled toward Ramses' camp, bringing the terror with them. The Hittites tore through the Egyptian perimeter. The royal guards were butchered. The invincible Pharaoh was suddenly surrounded by the smell of his own men's blood. And what did the great Ramses do? He fled. Modern military analysis suggests the battle was a chaotic stalemate at best and a humiliating near defeat at worst. Ramses was saved only by the arrival of elite reinforcements at the last possible second. He didn't conquer Kadesh. He didn't destroy the Hittites. He retreated to Egypt with a shattered army and a bruised ego. But this is where the predator truly excelled. He didn't return in shame. He returned in triumph. He commanded every surviving craftsman in the kingdom to carve a completely invented version of the battle into the walls of every major temple. In this version, there was no retreat. There was no terror. There was only Ramses, standing alone in his chariot, single-handedly slaughtering the entire Hittite army while the gods cheered from the clouds. This was not propaganda. It was the most elaborate act of historical fraud ever committed by a single human being. He silenced every living witness. He made the lie permanent in stone. For 3,000 years, the world believed his version. He didn't win the battle of swords. He won the battle of perception. He proved that if you control the record, you control reality itself. The end of Ramses II was not a grand explosion. It was a slow, agonizing rot. The man who spent 66 years carving his face into the hardest stones on earth eventually found himself trapped in a body that was failing him. By the time he reached his 90s, the living god was a walking ruin. Modern forensic analysis of his mummy reveals a terrifying reality. The pharaoh was riddled with arthritis so severe he could barely walk. His teeth were a battlefield of abscesses and decay, worn down to the nerves by the very desert sand that he had used to build his monuments. The man who demanded deep sunken relief, so his name would never fade, was now being eaten from the inside by the friction of time. When he finally died in 1213 BC, he left behind an Egypt that was architecturally magnificent but spiritually exhausted. He had sucked the marrow out of the empire to build a limestone hallucination. He had bankrupted the future to decorate the present. But the predator had one last trick. He had created such a massive gravitational pull of propaganda that for 3,000 years, history itself couldn't escape his shadow. We called him Ramses the Great. We taught our children about his victories at Kadesh. We admired his piety at Abu Simbel. We fell for the trap. We looked at the 60-foot statues and we surrendered our rational minds to the scale of his ego. We forgot the men who coughed up their lungs in the Aswan quarries. We forgot the kings whose names were ground into white powder under the cover of night. We forgot the daughters who were forced into his bed to satisfy a paranoid delusion. We accepted the golden lie because the lie was carved in granite and the truth was only written in blood. Today, we are finally cracking open the tomb of the most dangerous fraud in ancient history. We are looking past the polished mask and seeing the sick mind underneath. Ramses II didn't just want to be a king. He wanted to be the only king. He wanted to own the beginning and the end of the world. But stone, eventually, turns back to sand. The statues at the Ramesseum are now shattered fragments on the ground. The invincible colossi have been toppled by earthquakes and gravity, the only two forces Ramses couldn't bribe or threaten. His name is still there, yes, but it is no longer a declaration of power. It is a warning. It is a warning about what happens when a leader becomes so consumed by his own reflection that he begins to see his people as industrial grease. It is a warning that a legacy built on theft is not a legacy at all. It is a crime scene. What you have witnessed over these 6 chapters is not the story of a hero. It is the autopsy of a soul that was so hungry for eternity that it tried to swallow the entire Nile. Ramses II wanted you to see a god. But when you look closely at the deep, jagged wounds he left in the stone of Egypt, you don't see a god. You see a scared, paranoid man, standing in a dark corridor, desperately trying to scream his own name into the void, hoping that if he screams it loud enough, the second death will never find him. He was wrong. The silence has finally caught up. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.